Good afternoon and welcome to the ALCTS webinar, Workflow Maps and Tools for Insight and Enhancement. I'm Eva Sorrell, a member of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. Our presenter today is Kristen Wilson, Associate Head of Acquisitions and Discovery at the North Carolina State University Libraries. Kristen manages the department's Serials Unit and has been involved in workflow mapping and analysis of processes across the continuing resources lifecycle. She also serves as editor for the Global Open Knowledge Base project. In this role, she is organizing a community to create and maintain openly available metadata describing electronic resources. Her presentation will provide an introduction to workflow mapping, including best practices for structuring a successful workflow mapping project. A few things to keep in mind for today's presentation. Today's webinar does not have interactive chat capabilities. If you wish to comment on today's presentation using Twitter, you may use the hashtag you see on your screen, which I realize people aren't seeing my screen, and I'm not sure why that is. Let's see. While I'm trying to figure that out, I'm going to keep reading. We will not be monitoring the Twitter feed. If you have questions for Kristen, please type them into the question box on your screen and she will answer them as time permits. Questions which remain unanswered while we were on the air will be answered offline and the answers sent to all attendees. This webinar is being recorded and you will receive an email with links to the recording, the presentation slides, and an evaluation within 2 days. Please take time to fill out the evaluation form since it will be used by the committee to plan future events. There may be a slight delay as I turn the presentation over to Kristen.
Hi everyone, and thanks for coming to the webinar today, and thanks to Eva for getting us started. This webinar is called Workflow Maps, Tools for Insight and Enhancement. And I'm your host, Kristen Wilson, so I just wanted to take a minute to introduce myself. As Eva mentioned, I'm the Associate Head of Acquisitions and Discovery at the North Carolina State University Libraries. And I think I've been doing some form of workflow mapping and analysis for pretty much my entire career at NC State and in many different circumstances. So a few of those I'll mention are, one, I did a lot of workflow mapping when I first started off at NC State. I was a brand new librarian. That was my first job, and there was a number of circumstances that led to that being a really useful project. So I will talk a little bit more about that as we go. I've also been involved in the design of Kuali, which is an open source library management system, and so we found that workflow mapping was really useful in that context to kind of figure out how to support work. And then I've also been involved in a merger between our acquisitions and cataloging departments here at NC State, and so again, workflow maps were a really useful tool in those circumstances. So I'll be mentioning those as we go. And then here's just a quick overview of what I'm going to cover in the webinar today. The main goal of this session is to provide an introduction to workflow mapping and to share some basics that will help you get started at your own institution. So I'll be talking a little bit about why workflow maps are useful and in what circumstances they are a good tool. I'll go over some basic mechanics for workflow mapping, so some of the symbols that are used and some software that's useful. And then I'll talk a little bit about structuring a larger project around workflow mapping, and this is probably the most important part of this webinar, I think, because workflow maps really are meant to be used, and so I think that talking about how you can use them really brings out a lot about why these are such good tools. And if you have any questions during the webinar, I'm going to be trying to keep an eye out on the question box and answering answering things as we go. So if there's something that just sort of fits in with what I'm talking about, I'm happy to stop and address that. And then I'll also try to save a little bit of time for questions at the end too. So I'll start off by talking a little bit about what a workflow map is and about the advantages of using workflow mapping as a tool to engage with your procedures. So first off, what makes a workflow map? And the example that I'm showing here is really just to give you a sense of the basic structure, so don't worry too much about trying to read the small print or anything. This is just kind of to show that workflow maps give a visual depiction of the steps in a process. So there's symbols that represent different types of activities, and then there's arrows that represent the flow of information across the workflow. And so the workflow kind of shows where decisions have to be made and paths can kind of diverge, show things like handoff points, and also give some boundaries to the process. So there's usually kind of a start step and an end step. And then there's a few other characteristics of workflow maps that I think are important and that I want to highlight. So the first one is that workflow maps should represent how work is really getting done. So this means not how you think that it should be getting done or how it would be getting done in an ideal world, but in the best circumstances, your map should really represent what's actually happening. And for this reason, workflow maps must be made with the input of the people who are actually doing the work. So that's going to be one of the key points in actually creating the maps and doing a project. The second point here is that a workflow map should describe a repeatable sequence of events, and this makes them a good fit for processes that are more concrete, production-oriented work that does tend to repeat. And so I think that makes them a really good fit for tech services work, so things like ordering, receiving, setting up access, where you've got a flow of resources and you're repeating those same steps again and again. You can use workflow maps to map more complex processes, but you'll often have to do them at kind of a higher level, because if you're mapping something that's a little more intellectual or not kind of routine, then it can be hard to really make those steps repeatable. But I will show an example of where we tried to capture some things that are more complex. And then finally, workflow maps should be constructed in a way that will allow them to be used for assessment. So they should be clear and easily understood. It's definitely good to make sure that they're at the right level of depth, so not too detailed or not too high level for your purposes. And they should be used. I think that's the key point. So there's not a lot of good in creating workflow maps and then just letting them sit around. It's really, the point of creating them is to take them and do something with them. And so I'm going to talk now a little bit about some of the particular use cases where I think workflow maps can really be a good tool. So the first one is understanding work. And I think a lot of times it happens that we have processes and workflows where no one really has a full understanding of how that work flows from start to finish. And there's a lot of reasons that that might happen. One of those is a loss of institutional memory. So you might have one or more people who retire and take the knowledge of that process with them. You might also have processes that are just really complex and that go across one or two or even more different departments of the library, and so it's hard to have the big picture view of those because there's so many people involved and no one person is completing that process from start to finish. And so, or you may have a combination of those two that just lead to kind of a void between the start and the end point of your process. And so one example of this that I've experienced is when I first started at NC State, I came in to work in NC State's Fellows Program for new graduates, and so I was brand new to libraries, and I was also coming into our cataloging department at the time, which had had several long-term staff members retiring. We had a brand new department head, and so work was still getting done, but I think people just sort of knew, a lot of people were just doing their little part of the process, and people didn't really have a big picture view of what was going on. And so I worked with our new department head at the time to create a workflow mapping project, and we actually mapped out a bunch of our serials cataloging workflows, and that was really useful for me to gain an understanding of the work, but it was also really useful for our department as a whole to kind of find all those different pieces of knowledge that were spread out among lots of different people and to pull them all together into one start to finish workflow. And the process, I think it's really good because it also, because you're putting so much effort into the workflow maps, you really internalize the processes and are able to gain a full understanding. So I think that just understanding the work alone, this can be a really valuable tool. The next use case is improving work, and so I think that's kind of the next natural step. So we often have processes that we kind of know intuitively are cumbersome and inefficient. So in this example here on my slides, you might have things like you're completing a process, getting to a decision point, and several things might be happening here. You might have a decision that needs to be made, but no one actually knows how to make it or who should be making it, so you might get pieces of work coming out of your workflow that just no one knows how to deal with, so they kind of go off into a void and languish. Or you might have, you've got this decision point, but again, because you're not sure what the best thing to do is, that just kind of gets cycled back to another person. So sometimes you can get into kind of these loops where things are just kind of going around because no one exactly knows what to do. Or you might just have places that are inefficient or that don't take into account changes in your organizational structure. So an example of that I've come across is here at NC State. About 3 years ago, we had a merger between our acquisitions and cataloging departments into a single department. And workflow maps were a really helpful tool to have around at that time because, going back to the previous slide, they really helped with training and just getting everybody to a shared understanding of our workflows, but then they also helped with improving work because it was a way to see where once we started to get new skill sets developed among our staff, we were able to figure out more efficient ways of doing things or people who could take on certain parts of the process. And so again, that was a really useful way to sort of take our new circumstances and improve our work to better fit that structure and just to be more efficient in general. And then finally, workflows provide a good way to document information about your work for posterity and for future analysis. So this slide just shows an example of the wiki space that we have at NC State. And so for our serials unit, we have a whole page where we have documented all our workflows, and we've grouped them into kind of broad categories. You can see acquisition and description is one here, but we've got things like inventory control and even automated processes like record loads documented. And these are really nice because they can be easily shared both among the people who do this work and among the broader library. So if someone's coming to me with a question about, how does the new order processing work for serials, I can pull out these maps and share it with them, and that gives a really good starting point for helping others to understand your work. The other really nice thing about doing this kind of documentation is that as things change, you can pull out your workflow maps and use them again to kind of regain your understanding of a process or to make new improvements. And so with the serials unit, we've actually made an effort. We have a monthly unit meeting to go through one workflow map at almost every monthly meeting and just, kind of ask ourselves, is this process the same? Is there anything about this that strikes us that should be changed or is confusing? And we almost always find something. So it's pretty rare that you would document a workflow and then just find that that workflow stays exactly the same for years and years. We're finding things changing probably every few months. So now I'm going to move on to talk about mapping basics, and so I'll be getting more into the detail of what goes into the creation of a workflow map. So I'll talk about common syntax for workflow mapping, and then about a few examples of some common software that you might use to create maps. So I'll start out with mapping symbols, and the first symbol that I'll talk about is the rectangle symbol, which represents a process. So I try to think of a process as a concrete step that's carried out either by a single person or a single type of role. So it could be, something that I do, or it could be something that a librarian does, or a staff member does, or a certain type of staff member does. So, but the thing is that it's kind of concrete and it's kind of one thing that you can do. So some of the examples that I have here on the slide are things like creating a purchase order or placing an order with a vendor. And these activities can vary in scale. So you might have something like create a purchase order, which if you think about that, you could really break that down into even smaller steps. So you might say, I open up a new purchase order record in my ILS, and I populate the vendor name, and I populate the price, and there's lots of little steps that make that up. But if I put in every one of those processes to my workflow map, it would probably become unreadable because there would be way too many steps. So what I want to capture is that in the example of creating a purchase order, that's kind of one thing that hangs together intellectually that shows, I'm interacting with my ILS or a certain system, but it doesn't get too granular. And on the other hand, I could also go even broader. So I could create a process symbol on a workflow map that just said something like order a resource, but that might be too broad because there's lots of steps involved with that. And there may be reasons I want to capture those, like there's multiple people involved or multiple systems. So as you're creating workflow maps, it's just really helpful to be thinking about, I guess, sort of what your goals are, what you want to capture, who your audience is, so you can create things at the right level of granularity. And so you can think about things like capturing handoff points between processes, between people or units or different systems or physical locations. But one of the keys is just to remember that with a workflow map, you really want to be showing a little bit more of a high-level process, and you don't want your workflow map to just become like a step-by-step procedures document that someone can pick up and actually do the whole work with. That's kind of not the goal of this. So the next symbol is the diamond, and this is the decision or a decision point or a branch that creates two separate paths in your workflow. And so traditionally you would kind of have a yes-no split with this, where there's two paths coming out of here, say from two different points, and you're kind of asking yourself a question mentally like, does this resource require a license, yes or no? And then you kind of choose your path based on that, kind of like a choose your own adventure kind of book. But you can also use the decision points to split work in different ways. So sometimes I like to do a split by format. So I might say, what is the format of the resource I'm dealing with? If it's print, I might go down one path. If it's electronic, I might go down another path. So it's really kind of any time you have a natural dichotomy where the work splits off into two different paths, that's where you would use a decision. And the other thing that's important to note is that it's called a decision point, but it may not be that the person is necessarily making a decision. It's more like they're recognizing that this decision has been made. So if the example is, does this resource require a license record, the person might just have that information. They're not necessarily thinking, oh, well, do I want a license or not? Like, it's just kind of, it is what it is, and you're just figuring out what is the circumstance. The next group of symbols are connectors, And connectors allow you to define the boundaries of your workflow or to make connections to other processes. And there's more variations on the shapes for these, so it doesn't really matter that much which ones you use. You can kind of use whatever you like. I like to use like this long oval or rectangle as a start and end point, so you could either label it start or end, or you could put kind of your starting step in there to show that that's the beginning or end of a workflow. This one that's kind of shaped like a home plate is often used as an off-page connector. So if you were directing somebody, say you were showing your workflow for ordering an e-resource, but then you wanted to direct people to your license workflow, you could kind of use that to say, okay, you're going to leave this workflow for now and go off to the license workflow and then probably come back here. And then the circle can kind of be used similarly. Sometimes I like to just use that if I have a multi-page workflow. You kind of get to the end of page 1 and you would say, label that circle A, and then you pick up with the corresponding A circle on the next page. And I'll show some different examples that use these connectors, but these are basically ways to get a little bit more complex because sometimes it's hard to fit everything into one page, especially if you're dealing with a more complex workflow. And then the next group is the arrow symbols, and these are pretty simple but very important because they show the direction of your workflow from one step to the next. And when you're reading your workflow map, you're basically just following the arrows so you can get from the start to the end and see your path along the way. And so arrows should always go in one direction, and technically, a process should only have one arrow coming out of it, but a decision point can have two, and that can be the flow of material. So it could be, I'm cataloging this book and then I send it to my marking area, or it could be information like I've cataloged this database and I'm letting a collection manager know that it's become available. And then these are a couple other symbols that I have found really useful. One is creating a color code to show who does what, and this can be really helpful if you're trying to do some analysis of handoff points and getting a sense of how many people are involved in a workflow, because that's something that I think can be lead to inefficiencies is when you have a workflow where you just have a ton of people involved and you're constantly trying to hand things off from one person to the next. And the color codes can either be by role, so this example has different roles like a unit head or an e-resource librarian, or if you were dealing with either a smaller workflow or maybe a smaller workplace where you only have one person in each role, you could actually put individuals' names in here and show really who does what. Annotations are useful if you've got a process or something in your workflow and you want to give a little bit more information about that. You can basically just use that as a place where you can put some notes that give additional context. And then finally, parallel processes are when multiple things are happening at the same time. The thing with the other workflow symbols and the arrows is that they are mapping out kind of a logical flow where each step has to happen before the next step can take place. But I think it's pretty common, especially in library tech services right now, that there's often different processes that can happen at the same time. And it could be one happens and then the other, or they both happen, or they happen the opposite way. So it's really nice to be able to show that parallel process. And there is plenty of other workflow syntax, including symbols to indicate things like whether you're passing on a document or material or information, to do things like document sub-processes to show where systems and databases come into your workflow. But in my experience, the symbols that I've just shown you are really the only ones that I use on a regular basis. So I think you can really create a pretty nice and fully featured workflow map while also keeping things really fairly simple. So now I'm going to show a few examples from some of the workflow maps that we've created at NC State to show how you can pull all of these symbols together. And so these are just kind of snippets from larger workflow maps, but I tried to pull out examples that either do some interesting things or show a little bit of how these can be put together. So this excerpt is from NC State's new order workflow, so this is for serials as well, I'll just mention. And so this is kind of picking it up in this process where some of the licensing stuff comes in. So we use Trello, which is a workflow tool. So in this step, you can see that we're, and the green here is our staff. So the staff member is adding a license to Trello and letting our license team know that the license is there and needs to be reviewed. And so here you can see we've got an off-page reference. So this is going to license negotiation, which is in itself a whole other process that it wouldn't be very easy to show in the middle of this workflow. So basically saying, go and look at this other workflow map and then come back here. And then there's a decision point to see if this license has been negotiated successfully. If it has not, it would just go off into some sort of, we're not going to buy it kind of place, and maybe we would put it in a queue and hope that we could get it another time. But if the license is negotiated successfully, then the license reviewer would notify the staff member that the license is completed, that it's been signed, and then the staff member can pick up this workflow and actually go on and place the order with the vendor. And then you can see following here, we actually come to one of these parallel processes where there's several things that can happen at one time. So there's another decision point where the person working on this would need to ask themselves, what is the format that we've ordered? And this breaks off into print and electronic. And one of the things about this that's kind of bending the rules a little, which is something that we've done a lot too, but I think it can be really useful to do that, is that sometimes you're ordering print, sometimes you're ordering electronic, sometimes you're ordering both. So you may have to do some print access point creation, so things like setting up the link resolver, cataloging the resource, all that stuff. And you may need to do that for the E version too. And we found that with print and electronic, they're often the kind of completely independent. Like you might get the print right away but not get the e-resource for months because the access is a problem, or you might get the e-access right away and then the print just takes forever to come because like it's a quarterly or something and it just doesn't come. So these could kind of happen at the same time, or one could happen well before the other. And then in our process, also at the same time, invoicing is another parallel process. So we might pay the invoice before we even get access, or in some cases the vendor gives us access and then we don't pay the invoice until they send it to us. So when it comes to these three steps, we kind of never know which one is going to happen first. So this was an area, I think, this whole thing that was challenging to represent. So it took some kind of experimenting with a way that could show the complexity. And then, of course, each of these is its own process with its own set of steps. And we have workflow documents that detail those in more detail. So that's one example. This is another example, and this is from our workflow that we actually created a workflow document for our MARC record service. And so this is kind of experimenting with mapping automated processes, even though this is a process that does have a mix of automated and manual steps. So we kind of used the color code here to mark the automated steps in gray, and then the colored blocks show where human intervention is necessary. So when you look at this entire map, it actually gives a really nice visual to see, okay, how much of this process really is automated, and then also to see just how much manual intervention is still required. So there's some examples here. This one was on my other slide where I've got an annotation and I've got another off-page reference where here, working with our MARC record service, if we found that a MARC record was not available, we'd actually have to go back to create that e-access point ourselves. And you can see this here, e-access point creation, and this here, these actually reference the same workflow. So one of the nice things about creating your workflows in different documents is that you can make them sort of modular, so you can always reference them and kind of plug them in wherever you need them, which is pretty nice. And I've used two different symbols there, which again, those connectors are a little bit more, there's kind of some different choices. It doesn't really matter which one you choose. Another thing that we've done with this workflow that is, I think, pretty nice is that we have put in some time so I can see when I'm dealing with this MARC record workflow, after I've activated a title in my knowledge base, and then eMatrix is our local ERM, so some information gets pulled into there. Then I have to wait a couple weeks for my MARC record service report to be available before I can do the next step. So when you have workflows that take place over a longer period of time and there's a lot of waiting, it's nice to put in some information there about how long you actually have to wait, and that gives people, I think, some good context about what to expect. And then I've got one more example here, and this is from our license workflow, and this is a workflow that I think is a little bit more challenging to try to create a workflow map for because it's more complex and it's less repeatable, since essentially when it comes to licensing, anything can happen and probably has. So this is actually crazy complicated looking, and I think it still almost struggles to convey the information that it's trying to convey, but I think it does an okay job. So one of the things that we've done here is to try to make this workflow make sense by mapping it at a higher level. So you can see that we're not trying to address specific license terms, like does this license have a limitation of liability, because that would just be way too complicated. We're really more focused on handoff points and who's involved in the process. And you can see here, and I think in one of the other ones we had this too, where we have kind of this gradient of two different colors. And this is where in our color code we have multiple people or multiple roles who might be involved in this. So with our licensing process, usually this is handled by one of the librarians in our acquisitions and discovery department, but it also might be handled by somebody from our library administration or our digital scholarship person. So this kind of just shows that there's two roles that might take this on. And you can see, I won't try to go through this every step, but basically we're doing a lot of negotiation and trying to show that we're negotiating with the vendor, but sometimes this negotiation requires aid from someone in our library administration, and sometimes it requires aid from our university legal counsel. So this is also another place where we kind of bent the rules by having a process that actually leads to two different decision points. And you're technically not supposed to do that, but there's really no reason that you can't. So, you know, there's no need to be like adhering exactly to the rules if there's a place where you think an exception makes sense. So, you know, there's kind of two different paths where we're just consulting with people, and then, you know, we're coming to another decision. Is further negotiation required? If it is, we might just go through this loop again. And with license negotiations, we're just trying to represent the fact that there are times where we go through some of these loops 3 or 4 times before we can get to the point where we actually know if the negotiation is successful or not. And then this should have a yes too, but either it's not successful and we don't purchase the resource, or more likely it is successful and then we would go back and complete the ordering part of the workflow. So I think this is an example of a more challenging process to represent, and a good example of how in some ways your work is never really done, because even pulling this out again, I thought, oh, we probably could do a better job of mapping this. So it's really useful to continue revisiting your workflows. So now I'm going to go over a few tools for workflow mapping. And I'll start out with what I think is one of the more popular tools. This is Visio, and this is what we've used primarily at NC State for our workflow mapping. And so Visio is a Microsoft product, and what's nice about that is that you may already have it. If your library has a Microsoft Office suite, this is often included. And so it's worth seeing if you've got access to Visio. And the other nice thing about it being a Microsoft product is that it's got familiar controls. So all of the text formatting and colors and all that is very similar to Word or PowerPoint. So if you're familiar with those, it's pretty easy to pick up Visio and just start using it. And then the other nice thing about it is that it's got a pretty intuitive interface. So you have kind of this bank of shapes over in your left-hand side, and then you have your canvas where you're actually working with things, and you can kind of just pick up one of these shapes from over here and drag it into your working area and then type inside of it. And you can use the arrow, there's a little arrow tool that you can use to connect your different boxes. And I've found that most people really take to this really quickly. So if you have access to Visio, I definitely recommend that as a good starting point. Another tool that's pretty popular that I've seen a lot of people using is called Gliffy. And this is a little bit more of a dedicated workflow mapping tool. The other thing about Visio that I didn't really mention is that it's really considered a diagramming tool in general. So you can use it for workflows, but you can also use it to make lots of different types of diagrams, whereas Gliffy is a little bit more focused on workflows, I think. And the thing that's different about Gliffy is that it's a cloud-based tool, so you can see that the software is actually accessed through your browser, and that's pretty nice because it means you can access these anywhere and work on them from any computer without having to have specific software installed like you would with Visio. There's also some nice built-in tools for some more advanced workflow mapping features if you want to explore some of those. So an example of this is something called Swimlanes, where within your workflow you can actually create multiple lanes that might represent like different departments or different groups. So then you can see as you're going through your map, when it crosses lanes, that's another visual indicator that it's kind of crossed into a different area. So that's kind of an alternative to the color coding method if you want to be able to show the progress of work across different groups of people. And then finally, Gliffy is, it has a basic free account, and I think you can it says you can create 5 free diagrams, so you can go in and experiment with it. And then I think it's fairly inexpensive. I glanced at the pricing, so it's something where if you're looking to invest in a tool for workflow mapping, there's some packages for groups that are pretty reasonable. And it also works with some other tools like Confluence, which I know a lot of libraries are using, and with Chrome, so you can work offline and not have to be dependent on having an internet connection. So I think this tool has been gaining popularity. And then these are just a few others that are out there. Draw.io is a pretty newish tool, and this one is the only one that is completely free. It's a little bit on the more scaled down side, but if you're just looking for something to try out, then I would definitely recommend this as a starting point. It's also web-based, and it's extremely easy to get started. And then these are some others that are popular options, but that are all also have some cost associated with them. But most of these softwares, I think for the most part, use a pretty similar kind of that drag and drop interface where you're just pulling shapes out of a bank and into your canvas, and using a pretty familiar interface to add colors and text and the like. So if you're fairly comfortable with Microsoft products, then I don't think this is really a barrier. It's pretty easy to get started with the software. So finally, for the last part of the webinar, I'm going to talk more broadly about how to design a workflow mapping project at your institution. And this is worth thinking about because it's actually pretty difficult to just sit down and start making workflow maps. There's a good bit of thinking and preparation and information collection that you need to do to get started, and then there's follow-up that you really should do to get the most out of the process. So I'm going to start off and just go over some of my suggested steps for a workflow mapping process. So I made a little workflow diagram to illustrate kind of the basic process that we've used at NC State and that we've had a lot of success with. So to start the project, the first thing we would do is define a scope for the project, then collect the information we'd actually need to do the workflow mapping, create the maps themselves, review those maps with stakeholders, and as we meet with stakeholders, kind of be asking ourselves, does this process work well? If the answer is no, then we want to revamp our workflows and then go back and kind of ask ourselves again. And you may repeat this cycle either wholesale or in parts several times before you get to the point where you feel like you're really feeling good about this process. It does work well, and then time is going to pass, and if the process is still used, you're going to want to go through this again. So I think that's one of the nice things about making workflow maps is that it facilitates this kind of iterative loop of always looking at your processes and being able to institute those improvements. And then at some point, maybe that process isn't used anymore, and then this would finally end. But I think as long as your process is still in use, it's really nice to kind of have this cycle of always periodically reviewing your workflows. And so each of these steps is fairly complex, so I'm going to go through them in a little bit more detail. So the first step so the first part I'll talk about is defining scope, and the first step of that is really identifying what you want to map with your workflow map. So that could be just a single process, or it could be a whole area or a whole department's work, or it could be somewhere in between. But it's really good to know this before you start because it'll help you answer questions like if you need just one workflow map or many, or how granular you want to be and how you want to break up your work. You should also decide why you're doing the project. So we talked at the beginning about understanding improvement and documentation. That will help inform your stakeholders and what you want to get out of the project and who you're going to pull in. And I'll also just put in a quick plug here for the Project one-pager, which is a favorite of my former colleague Tito Sierra. And it's basically a short document that helps you define scope, milestones, team members, and objectives for your project. And I think something like that can be really nice for something like a workflow mapping project and just kind of getting that stuff documented and making sure that you have a shared understanding between the people working on the project. The next step is collecting information, and this is especially important because, as I said earlier, you really want your documents to represent the work as it's actually getting done. And so it's essential to make your maps based on input from those who are actually doing the work. And so how will you know what they're doing? There's a few methods that I've found useful for creating workflow maps. The first one is shadowing, and this is probably the most effective one. And this is basically just gets at the fact that you really want to see the person doing the work actually do it. So this gives you a chance to sit down with somebody, watch them work through the process that you're going to be mapping. It can be really helpful to have them narrate the process, so kind of explain what they're doing as they're doing it, and you can ask them questions as they go. Maybe watch them do a few different to do the process several times to get a breadth of examples. One thing to note about shadowing is that sometimes it can be a little nerve-wracking for the person being shadowed, especially if you're their boss. So it's good to stress that it's not an evaluation of performance, it's really an evaluation of the workflow. And it's also sometimes nice to see more than one person do the same workflow because you will find a lot of variation. If you can't do shadowing, you can at least interview somebody who does that work and have them describe it to you, and sometimes just for logistical reasons that might be the best option that you have. And then if you do the work yourself, you can create a workflow map based on your personal experience, and that might be the one time that you could actually just sit down and create a workflow map from memory without doing research first, but I feel like shadowing or at least some interviewing is usually required. The next step is creating your maps. And for me, this is the most fun part. I think there's almost an artistic component to it, so you get to choose colors and try to make everything look nice on the page, and so I find that kind of enjoyable. This is also a good part of the project for one person to do. If you try to sit down in a room and create some workflow maps with multiple people, you'll probably just drive each other crazy. So I found it's usually best to have one person create some draft maps and then kind of go through them together and have that person go back and make any edits if necessary. And I've found it's also helpful during this stage to transcribe your notes or to try to type them up in an outline form, and that might help you process the information and also capture any gaps. A lot of times as you're starting to create your maps, you realize that you're still missing information and you actually need to go back to the shadowing or the interviewing step and get a little bit more information. And then as you're creating your diagrams, you'll want to think again about the granularity of what you're trying to get at, the scope of your project and your goals, and really try to design your maps to meet those needs, so either more detailed or less detailed or more high level or what have you. And then you probably will need to try it and then try it again. I found that it's, I'll do something and it doesn't quite work and then I just scrap it and do it again. So you make a lot of adjustments as you're working through this, but I think it's kind of iterative, so the more you do it, the more you kind of get a feel for it and are able to make your layout look the way you want it to. So the next part, and this is the last piece, is meeting with stakeholders to vet your maps and to work on any analysis that you want to do. And so your stakeholders who you'll want to meet with really will depend on the scope of your project and your project goals, but you'll definitely want to include the people who do the process that you were mapping, so the people who you shadowed or interviewed. It's really nice to go back to them and go through the workflow with them and make sure everything looks right. It's also good to meet with managers of the process, people who rely on the outcomes of the process, or possibly higher level managers who are trying to learn more about your department. The thing that I've found is just absolutely the most helpful thing is to, as you're meeting with stakeholders, walk through your workflow diagrams step by step, kind of like we did at the beginning of the section on structuring your project. Usually the person who created the diagrams will be the one to lead this, and you would kind of walk through each step as you go, have people ask questions or point out some of the inaccuracies or points of confusion in the workflow map, and this is what's really going to lead into the step of analysis and improvement, because as you're walking through these, it's just like things just jump out at you of, oh wow, why are we doing that? And who's responsible for this? And wouldn't it make so much sense if we just did this instead? So these things just kind of suggest themselves. And so just a few quick examples before I wrap up of things that you might want to note as you're walking through your diagrams. Points of confusion can definitely be a place where you'll find you'll find things that can be improved. So going back to some of my examples, in the example I gave of the initial workflow mapping I did when I was new at NC State, one area of confusion that came up again and again was proxy setup for new resources. Some people thought that this was being done when we first made a decision to buy something. Some people thought it should be done or was being done when it was being cataloged, and so no two people could really seem to agree on who was responsible for this or when it was happening. So, this gave us some impetus to figure out when and what that should be, and it also let us choose something that made the most sense rather than just sort of doing whatever because we weren't sure what we wanted to do. Unclear responsibilities is something else to look for. In the same project, we also realized that there was some unclear responsibilities when it came to notifying collection managers about new resources becoming available. Our acquisitions department thought that the cataloging department was doing it. The cataloging department thought that the acquisitions department was doing it, and so a lot of times it just wasn't happening at all. So that was, again, a place where we could make a decision about this and also make the right decision. And then inefficiencies are another good thing to look for, and we noticed this a lot when we were working on our departmental merger, especially as skill sets evolved among our staff. So our workflows for acquiring and making available a new resource from start to finish used to have a lot of handoffs between acquisitions and cataloging because each of those groups had very separate tasks and skill sets. And so every time something came up, it started in acquisitions, go to cataloging, but then sometimes we'd come back to acquisitions and back to cataloging. And as we merged and cross-trained those two units, suddenly we had a group of people who now had been trained in the entire process from acquisitions all the way through cataloging. And so those handoffs started to become really unnecessary because now the same person could do that whole work from start to finish. So as we continued our cross-training, we were able to go through our workflows and identify those points where the handoffs just weren't needed anymore and eliminate those and consolidate our work with one person, fewer handoffs. So I think that led to us realizing a lot more efficiencies in those workflows. And then finally, well, I guess I kind of talked about these things in what I was just talking about, but revamping your workflows, so talking about these areas of concerns, like some of the examples I just gave that come up as you review your workflows, figuring out your solutions, what you want to do instead. At this point, you might create kind of an aspirational workflow document where instead of mapping, here's what we actually do, this is the point where you could say, okay, now we're going to map what we want to do and then actually try it out. And if it works, then that can become our new workflow. If it doesn't, then we can go through the cycle again and try some different improvements and see how that works. And then, as I mentioned, you can just repeat. So we have been, and I think I mentioned this too, with our serials unit, we've continued to try to review one workflow at each of our monthly meetings. And I think this really just helps keep the message consistent about the workflow, everyone being on the same page, what's expected. It helps us to tweak things and then make improvements as we go. And I think it's just been a hugely beneficial process for us over the years, and we continue to review the workflows that we've done in the past, in addition to making new workflows as they're needed as new processes come up. So that's it for my slides, and so at this point I'll take some questions. And so you can just put those into the question box if you have them. So we have one question. Christina asks, how many workflows does the tech services at NCSU have? So for the serials unit, which is my group, I would say we probably have somewhere in the neighborhood of a dozen workflows, and some of those are larger processes that are broken down. So for, say, something like acquiring a new resource, we have a workflow for ordering, we have a workflow for setting up access points in our link resolver, we have a workflow for cataloging, and then we've got other workflows that are more on the maintenance end, things like periodicals check-in or binding on the print side. We've got things like our MARC record service. We have workflows for new records, updated records, and deleted records. So, and I think there's still a handful of workflows that we know we want to do that we just haven't gotten to yet. So things like renewals or bibliographic maintenance, like title changes, and those processes can be pretty complicated, so which is why I think it's taken us a little bit longer to get to them. And then, so our tech services unit is, we've got a serials unit, a monographs unit, and a third unit that does some financial things and also reporting and data projects. And so I'd say probably across the whole department, we may have like 20 or 25 workflows and probably some more that still need to be made. So you can really, depending on how granular you want to get, they will add up pretty quickly. You don't necessarily have to map everything, but since we've been doing this for so many years, I think we've built up a lot. So another question is, for using the workflows, do we use them to train new staff, or are there any other uses beyond just reviewing the workflow itself? We do use them for training, and I think they are really helpful for that purpose. So when we're working with a new staff member and going over a process with them for the first time, it's often useful to start with the workflow map. Because the workflow map's not really a procedure, it doesn't tell the person exactly how to do the work, but it does kind of give them that broader picture of who's involved and how does the whole thing work from start to finish. And so I think that can be a really nice way to introduce a new project or a new process when you're training. Let's see. The next question is, how long does it take to diagram a workflow from start to finish? I think this can really vary. There's been some that I think we've been able to do fairly quickly, especially when there are processes that are pretty well established and that there's a few people in the unit who know that process really well and can help with the shadowing and the interviewing and information collecting. And also processes where they haven't needed that much change. For some processes that are more complex, I think it can actually take quite a bit of time. The example I gave of the initial workflow mapping project I did when I first started here took several months. And I think that was because, you know, I did a lot of shadowing. I shadowed like 8 people or something on all different kinds of processes, and then creating the maps and going through them with all the different stakeholder groups. And sometimes you're going to end up having to meet with more than one group because, you know, you also don't want to be going through workflow with a group of like 20 people because I think that just gets a little bit too overwhelming. So you may want to meet with a few smaller groups. So I think and there's an article that I co-authored with Aaron Stahlberg, who was our head of cataloging when I did that project. That's called Me and My Shadow. That's kind of a little bit more about the shadowing process that we did, but also has some workflow stuff. And I mean, we probably spent like a good 6 months or more on that project, and it wasn't like the only thing that we were doing, but we were kind of working on it steadily throughout a while. Okay, so we've only got 1 minute left, and we've got a couple additional questions, so I will try to send out an email to those people with some more information about those questions. So now I'm going to turn things back over to Eva to wrap up the webinar.
Thank you, Kristen, for your engaging presentation on using workflow maps to improve library processes. Thank you to all our attendees. We hope you found today's session useful. You will soon receive a short online evaluation form. Please take a few minutes to respond to the questions and return the form to us. Your comments are very valuable and help the ALCTS committee plan new continuing education offerings. Information about all ALCTS webinars can be found on the ALCTS homepage. There are 3 more webinars on the 6-part Working with Continuing Resources series, as well as many others this spring. Please check out our web courses, for which we have multiple sessions scheduled throughout the 2015 calendar year. Our newest web course, Fundamentals of Cataloging, has already sold out for the first 3 sessions, so sign up now for the fall sessions. Be sure to watch for announcements for our upcoming e-forums, which you can sign up for. Suggestions for webinars and other continuing educational opportunities are welcome at any time. Please contact any member of the ALCTS committee or submit a proposal for a webinar using the online form on the ALCTS webpage under Online Learning. I would like to thank Joseph Nicholson and Mike Prees for providing technical support for today's webinar. The support they and their colleagues on the Technical Support Subcommittee provide make it possible for us to present these webinars smoothly. I would also like to recognize Heather Staines, representing CRS's Education Research and Publications Coordinating Committee. This is the committee that organized the webinar series at the request of the Continuing Education Committee by helping us to select topics and find presenters. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and we hope you will participate in other ALCTS for Continuing Education offerings again in the future.